it is. And just to start, so, again, you don't know what your fellow presenters are going to present until they do, and there couldn't have been a better setup for this presentation, because what they have been doing is describing all the ways that stigma hurts people, whether it's people who are actually living with HIV, or people in the community. And what I'm going to be presenting about is a project that was, is it gonna?
Yeah, you got it.
Eventually, here we go. A project that was a researcher, community-based organization collaboration called Project Change, and that stands for Challenge HIV Stigma and Homophobia and Gain Empowerment. And I'm also really excited that Mark Page was here earlier. He was able to describe the project a little bit in the beginning, and I'm gonna quickly move on to the, oh dear, I'm pointing it at you. Oh, no wonder, I'm pointing it at myself. There we go, okay. I have no conflict of interest. And as with anything, there's a lot of people to thank. And I want to just recognize right now in the audience, Stephen Gordon from Gay Men of African Descent, who was a partner in this research with us. And of course, Mark, who presented earlier from the New York Blood Center. I also want to note that David Matthews from Brooklyn Men Connect, which is a program of bridging access to care, that was the physical space where we enacted Project Change. I don't have to go actually into the background here because this has already been covered, but we know that there are significant disparities in terms of HIV in the United States. Gay men are overrepresented, Black people are overrepresented among people living with HIV, and actually if we go back, we can see that there are disparities in who benefits from the technologies that are developed for treatment, and we're also seeing those disparities in terms of uptake of prevention. We see the disparities in New York City, where we enacted this program, in terms of the distribution of HIV, concentrated in our poorest neighborhoods, and among people who are non-white. And we see this also reflected in other areas. The model that we use, that was the overarching model for Project Change, was a socio-ecological model. And what we've been hearing about so far is how stigma affects the individual. What we were really interested in is how can we change the social environment that people live in so that they don't experience stigma, so that they have less of an opportunity to internalize it, less of an opportunity to anticipate it. And that's what Project Change was about. So we used the socio-ecological model and of course, Laron, the life course model, which you described really beautifully before. And also central to this approach is the concept of intersectionality, which we've heard a lot about before in terms of how people identify and how those different identities overlap, but also where people sit. The person who said before, you see what you see from the, where you're standing or where you're sitting. And so we're sitting within these identities, but these identities are also reflected in systems. So we have the race system, and these are systems of oppression. We have the sex and gender system. These are not just systems out there like the solar system. These systems have function and they have a purpose. So these are the approaches that we use. So what are the social factors that contribute to HIV stigma? Well, interestingly enough, just a few weeks ago, we had a really interesting paper that came out that talked about what was the actual natural history of HIV in the United States. And we were able to look back at the narrative and the story that we constructed to explain HIV in the United States, and we were able to say, oh wow, we got it completely wrong, but what we did, and that was important to do, was to blame somebody. And so that was one of the genesis of HIV stigma in the United States. So Mark actually presented this earlier, so I'm trying, maybe I should look here, that might be better. So again, our project focused on trying to reduce HIV stigma and homophobia at the same time in a community. So we use these definitions of stigma and homophobia, and we also really focused on the process of how people are stigmatized and the functions of stigma, keeping people in, away, and down. And that was based on some of the theoretical work by Joe Phelan and Bruce Link and many, many others. I can skip this slide because this has been well covered, but again, briefly, we know that HIV stigma has tremendous negative effects on people who are living with HIV. We've heard a lot about the effects through the stress processes. We also know from the research that it reduces access to HIV treatment and prevention. So the biomedical technologies that are coming out that can help prevent HIV, stigma, and homophobia are standing in the way of that. Homophobia specifically, the research has demonstrated that it reduces access to prevention and access to PrEP among a sample of Black MSM. And this is important. Why we know this? Because access is the first step to prevention and treatment. So if you aren't able to access a space where you can get the knowledge and information in order to prevent or treat HIV, that's it. That's the end of the road for you. And that means that there's another person living in the community who hasn't been able to access what they need to stay healthy or to stay safe. So what we did was we wanted to develop an intervention that was community-based and not just focused at the individual level, not necessarily only focused on not internalizing stigma, and that focused and used multiple methods. And we wanted very much to take into account this process. And so this is the model that we used. We specifically in our intervention tried to unpack the stigma process. So in the first step, in terms of stigma, you have to label somebody. And I think we had a really great question before. Can me not labeling myself, how does that affect things? Well, and then one of the responses was, well, we don't label ourselves necessarily, but other people label us. And so we talked about, in terms of our intervention, when people were being labeled, why would, for example, a family not want their child to be labeled? Well, they want to try to keep them in the community, which is going to keep them safe. Mm-hmm. So we went through that for each of these steps. We thought about what was the function of each step in the stigma process, what is the result of that, and what is the intervention that we can use to address that. And so this is a very kind of busy slide that I developed that actually breaks that down and tries to show how at each step there was a function of the step, and then there was what we did to try to counteract that. And just so enacted stigma of discrimination. The goal of that is to keep people down, and what we really wanted people to do was to offer support. The mechanism that we used was critical consciousness raising and education, and that's what Project Change did. Project Change drew on anti-stigma work that had been funded by the New York City Department of Health to 2 organizations in New York City already. So it was an evaluation using an NIH R21 mechanism, but it was based on programs that had been funded already. That's really important because we've been also talking about where is the money for this kind of work? Where is the support? Well, we were really lucky. GMAD had an incredibly intricate Wipe Out Stigma campaign that we took parts of and put into this package. CANVA had another anti-stigma campaign that we took parts of and put into this package. BMK had a storefront in a high HIV prevalence, predominantly Afro-Caribbean neighborhood that we were able to use as a base. But without those resources, none of this would have happened. And I say that because people have been saying, what can we do, what can we do, what can we do? And I really want to make the point, we can't do anything without resources. And so it is my challenge to this conference to say, how are we going to get more resources? Because our program isn't running anymore because we've run out of money. But one of the steps that we tried to take is to show that it works, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So Mark talked about it before. It's a partnership between the Blood Center, GMAD, and BMK. We had 3 phases. We had a steering committee. We did all this formative research, and then we packaged the intervention and we delivered it to the intervention community, and then we had a control community with a similar socio-demographic makeup, but that didn't get the intervention. So the components of the intervention were the workshops and the trainings, There was a space-based sort of events that we did at BMK, and then we roved to different parts of the neighborhood, and we had a limited bus shelter ad campaign. Mark described the shoe theme, and that was very important because it really increased contact. It was designed to increase contact, increase empathy, and actually get people to do what's called perspective taking, which as the research has shown is associated with decreasing stigma and negative attitudes. And that's literally like bring in a pair of shoes, get a coupon, walk in our shoes. That was the theme that encouraged the perspective taking. And then the space component was also very important. We've heard a lot about a safe space. We were trying to introduce this space in the community as a safe space, not only for folks who are living with HIV or who may be LGBTQ, but also for everybody in the community. And we did that by actually, through the shoe drop and through these events, providing some material resources. Because one of the biggest concerns in the community is not HIV, but poverty and the effects of poverty. So that was one concrete way that we were sort of able to address that. Again, I spent a lot of time creating these models, right? Because we think that they really help us understand what we're doing. But the workshops had three major components that focused on knowledge, feelings, and skills. So knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, and these are all the areas that we covered. We had a ton of information that we provided. We had interactive programs that are activities that were again designed to enhance empathy, identify affective responses, perspective taking. And one of the big things that we also did was we really validated where people were coming from. And I think that this was very important, that we recognized that a fear of contagion was also often what was driving for people's first fears. And that presenting accurate information was really important to addressing that. With the community-based organizations that we worked with, we provided skills that helped them identify the policies and practices in their CDOs. So again, before we heard about what are some of the things that healthcare providers are doing, healthcare settings are doing that might actually prevent folks from wanting to come back in. So we addressed some of those through those trainings. So these are, and I don't have to do this because you guys did such a nice job of this, but these are sort of the pathways that we created and focused on. And we would talk to people about, well, what does it mean to an individual when you isolate or reject them from your family? What happens to that when you cut off ties, when you don't protect them from someone in your household, when you throw them out of the house, or when you gossip about them? What is that? And what ultimately does that contribute to? Alcohol and drug use, suicide attempts, HIV, STI infection, etc. So we mapped these pathways in the sort of the back end of the trainings, but we delivered them obviously in everyday language. And we did the same thing. And then we also, what are the activities that we could do that would reduce the likelihood of isolation and rejection? So we would identify rationale for actions, consider if those beliefs could be held without action that would be damaging, educate on how the action or behavior harms the individual and the community, and then again, increasing contact with members of the stigmatized group. And we did this for various pathways at each step. This is a picture of one of the pop-up events that we held. So we had 5 events at the site at BMK. We estimated that through the events and through the trainings, we came into contact with about 900 people. This is one of the events outside of BMK. We had bus shelter ads up for anywhere from 1 to maybe as much as 5 months. We thought we could only get 1 month, but it turns out that I guess no one else wanted to advertise at some of the sites we were at, so our posters stayed up for a while. I wish I'd known that because we would have put them up much earlier in the project. And to be honest, we really did change for about 6 to maybe 9 months. That was the active part of it. One of the things I want to also mention in terms of intersectionality was that while we were doing this, the Black Lives Matter movement was just spilling forth onto the streets of New York City. Every week there seemed to be a new event where an unarmed black man was shot by a police officer somewhere in America.